Thank you, Julian, for a great panel. And I wanted to welcome you guys to the patient experience in gene and cell therapy development cycle. And we have an amazing panel today that brought together an incredible expertise. And I wanted to briefly introduce our panelists, and then we will move into some of the questions so we have enough time for them to tell us their story. So we have today the pleasure and the privilege to have with us Jack Hogan. He is a patient himself who has received an FDA-approved gene therapy, and Jeanette Hogan, the mother of a patient. Jim Holland, who is an entrepreneur, CEO of Black Country, and himself a patient as well. We have Barbara Lavery. She's a Chief Program Officer in ACGT Foundation. And Dan Tesler, a clinical trial patient at the Brigham and Women's Hospital. And last, Sarah Thomas, who is one of our nurse practitioners and the professional development manager at the Brigham. So in order to set the stage, we have this remarkable arc of gene therapy and cell therapy development where patients play a very different role with advocacy groups between industry and the developers in this cycle. And from a patient treated with an experimental therapy in a clinical trial here in our panel to one that has received the first FDA-approved drug, we encompass all that arc. So this came to fruition because of the dedication of the patients and the families working together with advocacy groups to organize themselves and propel the work of researchers, clinicians, and the industry towards the development of these therapies. So I'm gonna pass on a question to all of you in the panel, which is, where do you see yourself in this arc? And what are some of the critical lessons you've learned that might help inform the work of the stakeholders with us here today? So I'm gonna start with Jack.
Hi, I'm Jack Hogan, and I had the first approved FDA gene therapy for my eyes. I had retinitis pigmentosa, which is a missing gene in my eye, which didn't work, and they created a synthetic copy of the gene I was missing, retinitis pigmentosa, and they placed it in my eye, and they removed the faulty one. And after the surgery, I had no side effects, and after my operation, and after a couple normal tests that we normally run, it was determined that my eyesight after the operation has actually improved.
Excellent. And I think it would be great, Jeanette, if you could tell us a little bit of what was that journey to get to receive the FDA-approved drug in the case of Jack.
Sure. So we had joined the Foundation Fighting Blindness when we found out that Jack was diagnosed with retinitis pigmentosa. We were told that there's no cure for it. Jack was probably about 3 years old at the time, 2 or 3 years old, when we realized that he was having eye issues. We brought him to many doctors, and finally he was diagnosed with retinitis pigmentosa. And they had told us there's no cure for it. So, as any mom would be, they go on the internet and start doing research. I found the Foundation Fighting Blindness, and we had joined it. And we were very active in their walks. And I had met a doctor from Philadelphia that was moving to Boston at the time, and he was working on a clinical trial for retinitis pigmentosa. So for some reason, we felt we connected the two of us with this doctor, and we in my heart, I felt that he was going to help Jack somehow, at some time. So we started seeing him when he was in Boston, and it came to that there was a clinical trial that was starting for retinitis pigmentosa for this gene therapy. So at the time, they had asked if Jack wanted to join the therapy. And Jack was only like 5 or 6 years old at the time. So we said that we were going to pass on the clinical trial, but as soon as it was FDA approved, Jack would be your first patient. And that's exactly what happened. It got approved in December of 2018, 2017. And then Jack had surgery in March of 2019. And he was the first person in the United States to have gene therapy surgery. He had 2 surgeries, one for each eye. His left eye was first, and then his right eye was second.
So it's a perfect leap into you guys that decided to participate when the drug was approved and have the experience of being the first ones. And I do want to pass on the question of where do you see yourself in this arc to a patient that did participated on the experimental drug during the clinical trial. So I think, Dan, if you want to tell us what was like and what is like to be participating in an experimental drug clinical trial.
I mean, I think first off, the clinical trials give a lot of hope that there's new treatments out there that could really help. And, you know, we certainly had a lot of questions going into it, and our doctors were really forthcoming with the information we needed to decide to go into the clinical trial. And looking back on it, I definitely think it's important for patients to participate in them to advance the standard level of care for diseases.
Excellent. And we're going to go into other questions, but I did want to hear, Barbara, you have a lot of experience in working with patients and patient communities towards getting the right steps for a therapy to be developed and then getting approved. Could you tell us, how do you see the advocacy groups playing in this arc?
Sure. So Alliance for Cancer Gene Therapy, where I am right now, we actually are a research-driven organization. So we're funding the early stage research that will then lead to the clinical trials, and actually funded some of the early work that led to Dr. Kyoka's trial that Dan is currently taking part in. So that is kind of at the very beginning of the arc, where we're funding the research that then moves through ultimately to the patient. But in other roles, certainly at Global Genes, which is an organization for rare diseases, there I was much more involved directly with patient communities and developing educational content and outreach so that people could more easily not understand, but just access the information when they needed it, and in kind of bite-sized pieces so you don't get overwhelmed. And I think there we worked a lot with the patients and patient groups to develop the stories and the content itself so that other patients could avail of it. But I know we'll get to this later. We ask an awful lot of patients in that process.
Mm-hmm. The perspective, yes, exactly. And it's a perfect segue to Jim. If you want to give us a little bit from both sides, like getting organizations started and how to lead new change, innovation, and then becoming a patient, and how that has impacted how you think about this, the arc of development.
Yeah, well, just first off, a few thoughts. Maybe I should share a little on my background.
Absolutely.
I have a background as an athlete. I was a competitive athlete for much of my life, competing in the sport of ski jumping. I competed in 2 Olympic Winter Games and was national champion 6 times. And so, as you might imagine, it came as quite a shock when I was diagnosed with early onset Parkinson's disease. I'm quite shaky, and it has affected my motor function and affected my quality of life in many ways, of course. Unlike some of these other people, I have not been in a clinical trial, but given my background following my athletic career as an entrepreneur, I have some resources and have been turning over stones and networking with scientists all around the planet in search of solutions, in search of answers to the puzzle that is Parkinson's. And one thing that I would call out that I think could step up the level of innovation and the rate at which things advance forward, there are some constraints by regulatory bodies that limit and constrain people that are eligible for clinical trials, in particular with respect to cell therapies and regenerative therapies. Oftentimes, they focus on people with the most advanced stage of neurodegenerative diseases. And I think that that's an unwarranted restriction. I think that it's unfortunate because oftentimes people that are in that advanced state of disease are less capable of regenerating in the first place. Mm-hmm. And furthermore, while I appreciate the FDA's function and all that they do to serve as a clearinghouse to regulate and maintain a level of safety with approved pharmaceuticals and approved therapies, I would love to be the director of my own body and be the one who can determine what level of risk I'm willing to take with my own body.
And it's a great point, and in the previous panel it was also brought up several times, is that there is a lot of nuances and complexities when it comes to engaging with the FDA, and the agency is there, as you said, to protect the health, the safety of the population. But when it comes at the same time to rare diseases and the patient experience, and what is that risk and what is that meaningfulness and what the treatment can do is a different conversation. And I'm glad that you brought it up, and allows me to get to Sarah and ask her a little bit if she could help us from the healthcare side, describe what is that kind of journey that patients have to go to, even when preparing for getting a clinical trial up and running, engaging with the FDA, and then when the clinical trial is there, what is the journey for those patients? And Sarah, if you want to also say, how do you think what we're talking about here could inform people in the different stakeholders in this development?
Sure, absolutely. I think that patients need to understand it's a very long journey. As a healthcare provider, I think that we are the bridge between the theory and the research and all the great work that's happening down straight to the clinical practice. But it is long, and there's a lot of investment from the patient. It is truly a selfless act. I think that for a lot of individuals, this research isn't local, so they're going to uproot themselves. They're going to financially have to quit their jobs, or their caretaker does. They have to move cities or homes or even countries, not just for the actual clinical trial, but I think that even after the clinical trials, a lot of our patients end up in different countries just because it's safer. And I think that there's a psychological and emotional impact that we need to really help our patients understand through this whole journey. There's going to be some good and there's going to be some bad, but we are there for them. But it is a long journey with a outcome that really isn't expected, or it's really unknown, right? We hope for the greatest good, but truly patients are doing a really selfless act helping us with our research. And I really think that advocacy groups and organizations and all of you out there really need to understand that any way that we can support them with resources, whether it be financial, education, psychological, emotional, would be really great to help these patients through this long journey.
Yeah, and I think it brings the necessity of not being alone in this journey and having not only your own resources, your family, your friends, but also advocacy groups that are playing a critical role. And I've seen industry being able to get to the patients, the natural history studies, what it requires to get to the FDA, because they are able to organize communities through the work of advocacy groups. And I think that's why this panel is so important for our forum, because it really brings that necessity in really clear, alive manner. And Barbara, I know you have probably experience of that interaction with the FDA. What is the preparation that is required? What are those milestones or steps or things that we need to do from the patient side, the patient community, the researchers, to be able to have that interact meeting, that IND meeting, to make a clinical trial and an experimental therapy possible?
Well, I mean, before you even get there, particularly with cell and gene therapy, but absolutely with rare diseases. The patient is the source of all the information and the knowledge that's going to help us get to a diagnosis first, before we can even do the research and figure out how to design a clinical trial. So, I'd like to think a little bit about this much discussed term of patient centricity. There's so many campaigns about putting the patient at the center of everything. But for cell and gene therapy, we're talking about therapies that are truly our own. They're coming from our own biology, coming from tumor biology. And with rare diseases, you're depending on the families and the patients themselves to document all of the symptoms that eventually will add up to a diagnosis, but it might be a diagnosis that only 2 or 3 people in one community might have. So there's enormous wealth of knowledge and value from starting to listen and work with patients really early on in the process, rather than saying, okay, we need you now, now that we have a clinical trial and we have to get it done in, however many months or years. So we just want you to participate now, and then you can go away again. And we're not going to tell you the results of the clinical trial necessarily, unless you keep bugging us for it. So, first of all, we're all patients. At some point, we're going to be a patient for some reason. So, if we talk about patient centricity, make sure that we really hold our own feet to the fire and do it as early as possible.
Absolutely. And you're highlighting, again, something that is very unique to gene therapy and cell therapy for rare diseases, which is the power of one. We need everyone. Everyone has something to contribute, is necessary to do this. So I wanted to ask, and I'll start with you, Dan, if it's okay. So how was it for you to have to decide, to go into a treatment, and what kind of impact do you feel your contribution in that research could have or is having? How do you see the power of one reflected in your own story?
I guess it was when we made the decision to do the clinical trial. It was a difficult one because I had already had the standard of care of radiation and chemo, and then even though the genetics of the tumor were favorable for the standard of care, it really just kept coming back and spreading. So I had a resection surgery done, and then it returned, and cyberknife radiation, and it returned again. So we're really choosing between the clinical trial or a front lobectomy, or really a change in chemo. So, among the choices, we ended up deciding that the clinical trial just had the most potential for a positive outcome at that point. And it turned out to be, a good choice. It was the last treatment I received. So I felt pretty positive about it.
And Dan, have you been in contact working in any way with other families, patients? Have you been able to see how your experience got shared with communities, with the patient advocacies? Have you had any of those other than being here in the World Medical Innovation Forum right now?
No, not really. And I think they're working on the report for the trial and probably opening up new trials on it as well. And I would certainly be glad to talk to anybody looking to participate in the future.
Very, very, very helpful sometimes to have someone that is going through it. But it's, of course, it's a personal decision, and the right timing has to come. And we are very grateful that you decided to take this one as your first one to share your story. So I think, Jeanette, you could tell me a little bit of, for you guys, what it felt to get the diagnosis. How was this sense of community or no community, or alone or together? Like how did your own experience and what Jack was going through inform the power that you had as a mom of a patient?
So when Jack was a baby, I mean, he was maybe 1.5, and you would just ask him to pick up his toys or, little things. He just wouldn't be able to find it. Like it was like he was a blind person. Like he would look up and then just like feel around. And then as he got a little older, like for instance, he would get up out of bed in the middle of the night and he would walk right into a wall. So and a side effect of retinitis pigmentosa is night blindness. So whereas when I get out of bed in the middle of the night, I could see. When he got out of bed, he was completely blind. He could not see at all. So he would walk into walls. He actually fell down a couple flight of stairs once or twice because right outside his room was, he was on the second floor and he fell down the stairs. He did not see the steps. So at that point, we realized there was something wrong. Like, why couldn't he pick up his toys, or why was he walking into walls? And at first we were like, maybe he's just clumsy and he doesn't see it. But then I realized when you're laying down in bed with your child and I would smile at him or like make a funny face, he wouldn't laugh, he wouldn't smile, he couldn't see my face when I was laying down with him. So that's when we realized that something was wrong. And he was young when we found out. So I mean, all the testing that we started, he had to do EKG, ERGs on his eyes.
Did you connect it with other families? Did you know of anybody else that had the diagnosis?
At the time, no. Since it's a hereditary disease, a lot of the doctors were saying, does someone in your family have it? And no one in our family has it. So they came to believe that perhaps a chromosome of mine and a chromosome of my husband's were both damaged, and that's how he got it, because like I said, no one in our family has it. So we didn't know anyone that had it, and until we joined the Foundation Fighting Blindness, like I said, I didn't know anyone that had retinitis pigmentosa and what the side effects were. And he's also he has no really peripheral vision. So it's really hard for him to see on the outskirts. So say playing sports or, driving, he can't really see on the outskirts.
So we're going to have to wrap up, but I do want to give the microphone back to each of you to say very briefly, if you have a message for the people, the stakeholders in the gene and cell therapy development, researchers, clinicians, industry, and the advocacy groups or the patients, what would be your advice? What would you ask them? You can choose either or, but let's try to get around all of you. So I don't know if you want to take the lead, Jim.
Just a high-level thought. Just first off, I would reiterate what I said. I think it would be important to reduce the constraints on who is eligible for clinical trials, in particular with cell therapies, and pull back from allowing only those people in the latest stage of disease to be eligible. Also, I think it's important for information to be accessible to patients. So to the extent that people can publish and broadcast and disseminate information, that will help certainly greatly.
Sarah?
I would agree with Jim. I think it's accessibility and really equity. I think we need to be able to really reach a lot more individuals out there, not just the ones that have the easy access to all of our research. So I think education and equity are really important.
Dan, do you have a message?
Yeah, I agree with Jim that it's, would be good to be able to become part of a clinical trial earlier in a diagnosis, where you wouldn't necessarily have to go through the standard of care and see it fail.
Jack, Jeanette, a message?
Sorry. I just want to say thank you to everyone that like helped me in getting involved with all the clinical trials that happened, all the research that went into it, and my surgeon, Dr. Commander, and without people like you, miracles like me would not really happen.
Excellent. And Barbara?
So thank you.
Thank you, Jack. Barbara?
I just say, you know, we're all in it together. We've got to bring patients in earlier and at every step, and don't expect them to just show up when you need them, but have everybody collaborate from as early a stage as possible.
So I want to thank you all for joining us and those on the other side of the camera. And before we move to the next panel, I would like to ask you for what you think in 2 poll questions that are going to come after we close this panel. So please take a minute to answer those questions, and we'll see you next.